Noam Chomsky's Turning the Tide, U.S. Intervention in Central America and the Struggle for Peace. A classic critique of U.S. foreign policy.
Absolutely. And it's often described as offering liberatory knowledge. It's a shortcut to understanding a reality that's often hidden.
Hidden how?
Well, Chomsky really digs into how he sees U.S. academia and media often misinforming the public, sort of obscuring what government policies are really about.
Okay, so our mission today is to try and unpack that reality as Chomsky presents it. He argues it shows a world that's, frankly, much uglier, often horrifying. And he makes the case that our own actions, or maybe just our passive acceptance, contribute to misery and oppression.
It's a challenging read.
Definitely. An essential deep dive if you're curious about those, let's say, unseen forces Chomsky argues are shaping global politics.
Right.
Okay, so let's get into a core idea right at the start, this fifth freedom. What exactly is Chomsky saying here? How does he argue it drives U.S. policy, maybe even more than the famous four freedoms?
Yeah, it's a provocative term. What's really striking is how Chomsky points to actual statements from high-level U.S. planners back in the day.
Okay.
He argues this fifth freedom is basically the freedom to rob and exploit. He cites documents like from the Council on Foreign Relations in 1941.
Right.
That apparently said, look, formulation of the statement of war aims for propaganda purposes is very different from formulation of one defining the true national interest.
So a difference between the public story and the real goal.
Precisely. Chomsky sees that as a clear signal. What was said publicly wasn't necessarily the actual strategic aim.
So what does that mean in practice then? How does this true national interest, as Chomsky defines it, actually shape how the U.S. deals with other countries?
Well, if you connect the dots like Chomsky does, you look at someone like George Kennan, a really key planner post-World War II.
Kennan.
Yeah.
Containment.
Exactly. Kennan wrote in 1948, look, the U.S. has about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population.
Huge disparity.
Massive. And Kennan said the main job was to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without harming U.S. security.
Okay, maintain the advantage.
And crucially, Kennan argued this meant we had to ditch the sentimentality and daydreaming about things like human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization.
So just put those aside.
Pretty much. He even recommended using police repression by the local government against communists. But Chomsky argues Kennan used communists very broadly, basically meaning anyone who didn't respect the sanctity of the fifth freedom.
Okay, that raises a big question then. If human rights and democracy are sort of off the table, what's the justification given for intervening?
Well, the rationale Chomsky identifies is what he calls the rotten apple theory, or sometimes the domino effect.
Right, I've heard those terms.
The idea is that even a tiny poor country, think Grenada or Laos, if it somehow manages successful independent development, well, that's dangerous.
Dangerous how?
It poses a threat of a good example. It might infect other countries, show them they don't need to follow the U.S. model or accept U.S. dominance.
So the goal becomes stopping that good example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Policy aims to retard that kind of progress, even if that means backing really brutal regimes. Chomsky gives examples where he says the U.S. even helped to create blocs, like the Sino-Soviet bloc, which wasn't inevitable, and then insisted it was this solid monolith to justify its own aggressive stance. It leads, he argues, to this curiously systematic foreign policy. On the surface, it might look confused and failing.
Yeah, you often hear that.
But Chomsky says, no, it's actually succeeding brilliantly at its real, unstated objectives, maintaining that disparity, that fifth freedom.
Okay, we've talked about the strategy, the sort of blueprint Chomsky lays out. Now let's get into the grim reality he describes. He uses this term unterror, terror by people against unpeople. What does that actually look like on the ground, according to the book?
Yeah, it's a chilling concept. He draws these stark contrasts. For example, think about the massive public horror over the murder of Leon Klinghoffer on the Achille Lauro.
Yeah, I remember that. Horrible.
Absolutely horrible. But then Chomsky contrasts it with, say, British reporters finding the flattened remains of a wheelchair of a Palestinian man, Kemal Zugair. He was reportedly shot trying to wheel himself away during an Israeli offensive in 2002, then run over by tanks. Chomsky's point is about the disparity and outrage.
Who counts as a person whose suffering matters?
Exactly. Who falls into that category of unpeople, whose suffering is essentially ignored or downplayed in the West.
That really hits home what he means by unterror. And this brings us right to Central America, which is, the core focus of Turning the Tide. What specific examples does he use there to show this unterror and the miseries of traditional life?
Right. El Salvador is a major case study. Chomsky highlights the testimony of Charles Clemens. He was a U.S. Air Force Academy grad, became a pacifist doctor, and spent a year, 1982-83, in a rebel-controlled free-fire zone in El Salvador. He saw firsthand what Chomsky calls the terror of the U.S.-run war.
What did he see?
He treated bodies mutilated by torture, victims of napalm, white phosphorus rockets used on civilians. He even said he could hear American advisors on scanners directing Salvadoran troops on mass murder missions.
Directing them. Wow.
And then there's specific massacres Chomsky details, like Rio Simple in May 1980, a joint Honduran-Salvadoran operation, over 600 peasants killed.
600.
And the details are horrific: babies used for target practice, children decapitated, drowned, burned, just unspeakable. And Chomsky stresses this was kept out of the U.S. media for over a year.
Suppressed. And what about the leadership, like President Duarte? How did he fit into this picture?
Well, Chomsky argues figures like Duarte served as a crucial democratic facade.
A facade.
Yeah. Duarte would publicly praise the military, deny the massacres. He even claimed those infants sliced to pieces with machetes at Rio Simple were actually communist guerrillas.
He said what?
It's unbelievable. Chomsky quotes a Salvadoran analyst who basically said, look, Duarte is the guy who unlocks U.S. aid money. The military knows they need him as the democratic facade, so everybody doesn't have to worry.
Okay, so El Salvador paints a truly harrowing picture. And Chomsky argues this wasn't just isolated, right? He sees similar dynamics in Nicaragua.
Absolutely. Different history, same underlying principles, according to Chomsky. The U.S. occupied Nicaragua militarily for years, 1912 to 1933.
Right, setting up the Somoza dictatorship.
Exactly, a regime, Chomsky notes, robbed and tortured. Then, after the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza in 1979, the U.S. backed the Contras.
The rebels fighting the Sandinistas.
Right, and Chomsky emphasizes that the Contra leadership was overwhelmingly made up of Somoza's former National Guard, like 46 out of 48 commanders by mid-'84.
So, the old guard, basically.
Pretty much. And Admiral Stansfield Turner, Carter's CIA director, was apparently quite blunt, stating the U.S. goal was always to overthrow the government of Nicaragua.
Always. Even when Nicaragua held elections.
Especially then, Chomsky argues. He says the U.S. government did everything in its power to block and discredit the 1984 Nicaraguan elections. They even got Arturo Cruz, later found to be on the CIA payroll, to drop out.
To make the election look illegitimate.
That's the argument. The Latin American Studies Association studied it and concluded Cruz's moves were more attuned to the policy debate in Washington than to the hardships of life in Nicaragua. Chomsky sees this all as part of a bigger campaign to just kill the dream of independent social change there.
And Guatemala, that features prominently too. What's the pattern Chomsky describes there?
Indeed. Guatemala is another key example. After the CIA-backed coup in 1954.
Right, overthrowing Arbenz.
Yes. Chomsky details how the U.S. then trained Guatemalan army officers, security forces, including units like the Mobile Military Police, who were later implicated in, well, numerous massacres.
And this support continued.
Well, yeah. He points to President Reagan in December '82, praising Guatemalan dictator Rios Montt as totally committed to democracy.
Rios Montt. But wasn't he?
Exactly. This was while thousands, maybe 3,000 to 8,000 people were being killed under Montt, hundreds of thousands displaced. Montt himself literally said he declared a state of siege so that we could kill legally.
Unbelievable.
And Chomsky notes a grim detail. When U.S. human rights restrictions sometimes kicked in, Israeli arms sales to Guatemala apparently surged.
To filling the gap.
Seemingly. He even cites a Guatemalan Army Staff college review that praised Hitler and quoted Mein Kampf while receiving Israeli aid. And the National University, a prime target. Rectors killed, dozens of students and faculty disappeared. A U.S. ambassador even co-wrote a book dismissing the university as basically a communist mouthpiece.
So this pattern of intervention abroad, supporting regimes, suppressing dissent, Chomsky argues it's connected to what happens domestically, right? How the U.S. public understands or doesn't understand these events.
Absolutely. He argues there's a remarkably effective ideological system at home that keeps the public largely misinformed.
How does he say that system works?
It's multifaceted. One key concept he draws on is Walter Lippmann's idea of the manufacture of consent, deliberately shaping public opinion.
Like PR for policy?
Pretty much. Edward Bernays, a huge figure in PR, apparently boasted about prepping the public mind for that 1954 Guatemala coup, called it a first-class public relations job.
What?
Chomsky also talks about brainwashing under freedom.
Mm-hmm.
He points to how major events like the U.S. attack on South Vietnam starting in 1962 essentially do not exist as an event of history. in mainstream U.S. media or scholarship. It's just erased in his view.
Erased. That's a strong claim. Can you give another example of this manufacture of consent that really stands out in the book?
Yes, definitely. He analyzes the media debate around aid to the Nicaraguan Contras in 1986.
Okay.
He looked at the New York Times and Washington Post opinion pages, 85 pieces by columnists, and invited contributors over a key period. All 85 were hostile to the Sandinistas, every single one. But Chomsky notes that not a single phrase in any of them mentioned that the Sandinista government, whatever its faults, wasn't actually slaughtering its own population like some U.S. allies were, or that it had tried social reforms.
So a very narrow debate.
Extremely narrow. Behind the scenes, he cites administration officials admitting they were actually content to see the Contras debilitate the Sandinistas by forcing them to spend money on war instead of social programs. Why? To destroy that threat of a good example.
So if the public is being misinformed, as Chomsky argues, why? What's the purpose? And he talks about this crisis of democracy. What's that about?
Right. This is crucial. The crisis of democracy wasn't a crisis for democracy in Chomsky's reading. It was a crisis of democracy from the perspective of elites.
Meaning too much democracy.
Essentially, yes. He points to a 1975 Trilateral Commission report. Samuel Huntington was a co-author, where they basically lamented the activism of the 1960s.
They didn't like people getting involved.
They saw it as a problem, an excess of democracy. They longed for the good old days when, as they put it, Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. The goal was to restore public apathy and passivity.
Wow. And how does military spending fit in?
Chomsky connects this to what he calls military Keynesianism. The idea is that huge military budgets aren't really about defense. They're about creating a state-guaranteed market for high-technology, rapidly obsolescing waste production.
So corporate welfare disguised as defense.
That's his argument. It benefits existing power and privilege. And the public, they're sold on it through appeals to, defense of the home.
Okay, so the analysis suggests the public is easily manipulated. But does Chomsky's research show that's actually true? What do people really believe compared to policy?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe hopeful in a way. Because despite all this propaganda Chomsky describes, he argues public opinion is often quite different from official policy. He cites polls showing massive public support for a nuclear freeze back then, huge majorities. Yet he says it had essentially zero impact on American politics.
Zero impact.
Virtually none on policy. He also pushes back against the idea of the Reagan landslide. Reagan actually got a smaller percentage of eligible voters than Wendell Willkie did when he lost in 1940. And only about 11% of Reagan voters said they chose him for being a real conservative.
Interesting. What about social issues?
Surveys consistently showed, 80% support for more spending on New Deal-style social programs. Huge opposition, 3 or 4 to 1, against cutting Medicare, Medicaid, favoring defense cuts instead. 3/4 supporting worker health and safety rules.
So the public wasn't actually clamoring for the Reagan agenda.
Not according to these polls, Chomsky cites. He argues the majority of Americans actually favor more, not less, government intervention in supporting people's lives and welfare. He even points to polls showing widespread belief that workers and the community should control business enterprises, though people wouldn't call it socialism.
Okay, so the system, as he describes it, works to limit public participation, but it's not completely successful. There are weaknesses.
Exactly. He does point to notable points of weakness. There's still a strong residue of resiliency and independent-mindedness in the population, he thinks, helped by the tradition of individual civil liberties.
So people can still push back.
Yes. And even just the standards of professionalism of reporting, while flawed, mean that accurate information is out there if you're willing to make the effort to escape the doctrinal confines.
You have to look for it.
You do. And critically, the fear of domestic disruption can actually restrain the government. He mentions Pentagon officials worrying about massive civil disobedience if they sent more troops to Vietnam after the Tet Offensive.
Public pressure matters.
It can. And Chomsky sees something like the Iran-Contra scandals in '86, not just as a scandal, but as a kind of tribute to the popular movements.
Yeah.
Because those movements make direct, overt aggression harder, forcing the government into covert operations, which then carry the risk of being exposed.
Right. Covert action is inherently fragile.
Mm-hmm.
So pulling this all together from Turning the Tide, it's a really stark picture Chomsky paints. A U.S. foreign policy driven, he argues, by economic and geopolitical goals hidden behind rhetoric about democracy and human rights.
Yeah.
A world where violence against unpeople is normalized or at least ignored, and where our own media, in his view, often helps manufacture consent for it all.
Exactly. And what's really crucial is that while he acknowledges the reality of brutal regimes abroad, the great Satan, as some called it, Chomsky, forces you to look inward. He argues the U.S. system itself, through its actions and the ideology that justifies them, actually mirrors some aspects of the evil empire it claimed to be fighting.
That's a powerful and uncomfortable comparison, which brings us to the bottom line, really. If these deep institutional factors are driving things, this race to destruction, as he puts it, what can individuals do?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question his work raises, isn't it? It's not just a critique, it's trying to provoke understanding. He suggests that just focusing on specific catastrophes, trying to delay them.
Like protesting a specific war or policy.
Right. While vital, he argues it's ultimately suicidal if you don't also address the underlying causal factors.
Meaning the structures of power, the military-industrial complex, the drive to crush independent development.
Exactly. He's calling for a much deeper challenge to the roots of the problem.
So consider this final thought from Chomsky. He points out that protesting specific atrocities is essential, but maybe it's also a sign of our weakness if those protests don't evolve into a challenge against the institutions that keep producing those atrocities. How might understanding this systematic pattern Chomsky describes change how you engage with policy, with the news, in your own life?
It definitely gives you a different lens to look through.